Welcome back to the In the Clinic podcast with Rob. And today, if you are looking to expand on why you're getting belly fat and you can't lose it, if you're wondering why you're having high blood pressure, but it's considered genetic, whatever that is, and you're wondering about why your liver enzymes and your cholesterol are coming out of whack and you don't know what to do about it, this is the podcast for you. So this podcast will dovetail right into our last podcast, which has to do with insulin resistance. And we talked about before with insulin resistance, the impact that it can have on your life regarding weight gain, regarding high blood pressure, regarding cholesterol levels, fatty liver disease, and more. So today, we're really getting into insulin resistance and how we use food to really impact our insulin levels. Now, we know that insulin levels come down to two main factors. We talked about this last time. When insulin is present, it is a fat storing hormone. So it's going to store more fat on your body. When it's not present, you're more in a fat burning mode. So by keeping those two mindsets, now we're talking about how does food relate to this and how you can biohack your own diet to improve your weight, to improve your energy levels, to improve your sleep, to improve all of your health metrics that matter, such as blood pressure, cholesterol, across the board, so that you can optimize your life, mobility, longevity. And that's really the key that we're looking for. So let's get started today. So how do we use what we eat to improve insulin resistance? Well, one, there's two conventional thoughts. It's a mathematics equation. It's calories in, calories out. It doesn't really matter what you eat. And the body is just a complicated furnace. And no matter what calorie you use is going to create energy for you. So it all just comes down to the amount of calories that you eat. The other type is that a calorie is not just a calorie. And that really comes down to the nutrients that you're eating, how you're eating them, the timing that you're eating them, that all will affect your body mass. So first off, let's look at just limiting calories. So a lot of different common dietary interventions have to do with just limiting your calories. Eat less, move more. That's what you typically hear. But if that was so simple, why is it not working? Because the same tool is used in a fixed insulin resistance. So this might help with weight loss in the short term, just by changing the amount of calories that you're consuming. But it might not improve your insulin resistance too much. Now, why is that? Now, calorie restriction creates weight loss, but it doesn't determine where the weight loss occurs. Now, here's the key. It can start to reduce lean muscle mass too. The less lean mass a person has, the less insulin-sensitive tissue is available to help clear blood glucose. That's what we're really talking about here. The less muscle you have available, because muscle brings glucose directly from the bloodstream into the muscle, doesn't even require insulin. So the more you have, the less need for insulin there is. So overall, what do we need to do? So think about the flip side of it. Think of severe caloric restriction. Think of individuals that have anorexia nervosa. They have eating disorders. And what they found with these individuals that severely restrict their calories, they actually become more insulin resistant. They're regularly found to be more insulin resistant than healthy individuals. So why is this? Because starvation will do this. Starvation will do this. So very low caloric diets stress the body with increased cortisol. So people who starve themselves really drastically start to see insulin resistance, and these changes occur over a short period of time, as short as a week. Because cortisol is the antagonist to insulin. It drives an increase in blood glucose. It can actually block the receptors for insulin so that blood glucose levels stay high. So overall, the key is mild caloric restriction is important. Mild. And those can help improve insulin sensitivity. But let's look at one of our key tricks. What about carbs? The key trick is that carbs should come last. Any of your rice, your pastas, any of those, you should eat them at the end of your meal, because they've found different studies that found that breaking parts of the meal into primarily starch, protein, or vegetable, that eating the starchy part of the meal after the protein and the vegetables has a significantly smaller effect on blood glucose and insulin. So if you eat your protein and your vegetables first, you're going to get less of an insulin spike or a blood glucose spike when you have carbs after. So the time of eating matters. Okay, what about dietary fiber? So a lot of different epidemiological studies found a correlation between fiber consumption and insulin sensitivity. So those aren't clinical trials, but just an association. Men with higher fasting insulin levels enjoyed a lower post-meal insulin spike when they consumed higher fiber meals versus lower fiber meals. But there's no difference between individuals with normal fasting insulin. So increasing dietary fiber over a period of several weeks has also been shown to improve insulin sensitivity in a group of non-obese people with diabetes. So the type of fiber could also help as well. So they looked at different studies where they used guar gum. And that's not really a normal part of our diet, but this is what they used for the study. And these individuals with insulin resistance were put on a high fiber diet from fruits, vegetables, legumes, and different grains that significantly improved their insulin sensitivity after 6 weeks. So the challenge, though, is that most high fiber diets are low in fat. And this is an issue for dietary fat overall, because dietary fat does not elicit a response to blood insulin. So this leaves a question as if diets that are high in fat and high in fiber are more effective. Because the problem is that most low-fat diets with increased fiber are not as satiating or satisfying to the individual as they need to be. So what about when we're looking at nutrition, what about intermittent fasting? So the timing of meals do matter. So in the past, I've done a podcast on intermittent fasting and the benefits. So the biggest takeaway from that is that, yes, insulin changes with intermittent fasting. And it is one of our most powerful ways that we can control insulin. And by controlling insulin, then this controls body fat. So one of the keys for us is if we can restrict fat building versus fat burning, then you can control what you want and why. So fasting overall creates a change in your hormones. Insulin drops, glucagon rises. This burns energy, insulin counters. So glucagon wants the body to release stored energy by pushing the fat cells to share their fat and the liver to share its glucose. That's the whole purpose of glucagon. And the more we can get glucagon to release, the more we're going to burn fat as energy. But again, glucagon and insulin work against each other. With a high glycemic index foods versus low. But I also like to note that your circadian rhythm matters. Insulin, cortisol, melatonin, they all have a relation to each other. Insulin and cortisol counter each other, and melatonin and cortisol counter each other. So the body is more insulin resistant in the morning. And this occurs naturally, and they call it a dawn effect. And this usually lasts about 2 hours after waking. So we need more insulin control in the morning with the foods that we eat than any other time of day. But what do we typically do? We typically eat the most starch-ridden foods in the mornings. Potatoes, breads, bagels, toasts, sweets, pastries. So by eating an insulin spiking meal in the morning, this just adds more fat to our frames compared to the evenings. We get a double effect. So one of the first ways that we can help improve our insulin levels is to control our carbs. Because too much insulin is the driver of insulin resistance. And there's a chain of events that suggest that the solution is that we eat fewer carbs, which this will then reduce blood glucose levels, which reduces your blood insulin. And in the end, it improves your insulin sensitivity. But what about the other macros? What about protein? What about fats? Now, protein will elicit a very, very mild insulin effect. Carbs, well, that will 10x your blood sugar levels, and it will last based on the spike that is created by the food that you're eating, how many carbs you're eating. But fat, on the other hand, doesn't change it. Your blood sugar levels don't change with fat consumption. So protein in your insulin response, this is really dependent on if you've also had carbs in your diet. A person that eats carbs consistently, you'll have a mild bump in insulin with protein. A person with normal to high carbs, when they eat that protein, they'll receive a higher than normal insulin response. But if we have an individual with a low carb diet, then the response to insulin is lower. And this is mainly because of gluconeogenesis. The body will start to slowly release glucose into the bloodstream from other sources, fats and proteins. And then it keeps a steady stream of glucose going that way. So then if you introduce a carb, insulin will be released and it will instantly block gluconeogenesis. So the key is to have a low carb effect so you can control your blood sugar levels over time through the fats and the proteins you eat. Therefore, you're not going to get much of a bottoming out where people get the shakes. They get those little shakes in their hands because they feel like their blood sugar is really low. And that's usually the occurrence because the body overshot the amount of insulin that it needed, and now it drove down your blood glucose too much. And that usually occurs when we have sweets. So if you look at carbs overall, there's consistent clinical research from 1990 on that have consistently showed that carb restriction prevents or improves insulin resistance. I mean, it's pretty much overwhelmingly supportive of carb restriction. There's been multiple studies that looked at carb restriction and the metabolic improvements over years. And it's been shown that not only was a lower carb diet significantly superior at improving health, it ultimately led to about half the individuals getting off insulin, medicated insulin, and the rest substantially improved their insulin requirements. There is so much overwhelming data about reducing carbs that the ADA updated its standard of medical care in diabetes to include the use of a low-carb diet for controlling type 2 diabetes. Now, please note that this is not a call to avoid all carbs, but only in context in the relation of insulin resistance. Not all carbs are created equal. So different carbs change the GI differently. So we need to look at the carb quality versus the quantity. So what is the response of that carbohydrate? That's how they measure the glycemic index or the glycemic load. So the glycemic load is an estimate of how much a particular carb will raise your blood glucose level over a period of time. But glycemic index is only a measure of how quickly the carb will raise your blood glucose. For us, we want to look at glycemic load. What is the total amount it will raise your blood glucose? That will tell you how long your insulin will be elevated. A glycemic index can be deceiving. Take a watermelon. It has a high glycemic index, but a low glycemic load because it's primarily water and sugar. So you're going to get a quick spike and then it goes away. Versus a complex carbohydrate will give you a spike over a long period of time. The load's bigger, which means your insulin's going to be released much longer. So overall, the key that we want to look at is glycemic load. And when you can just Google search this and you can look at different foods, and anything above 20 is considered high, a high glycemic load. We want to avoid those. Anything between 11 and 19 is moderate. We want to just use those sparingly. And then anything below 10 is more safe for us to consume. The lower, the better. So some examples, some low glycemic load foods are kidney beans, black or garbanzo beans, lentils, whole grains, certain whole grain breads, cashews, peanuts. High fiber also improves your insulin sensitivity. So we want fiber-rich fruits and vegetables. But what about saturated and polyunsaturated fats? Now, saturated fat has been demonized forever. That, oh, don't have saturated fat. It's going to clog your arteries. You're going to get heart problems. No, that's not true. And I've done a podcast on that. The key is the difference between a saturated fat and an omega-6 or a polyunsaturated fat, primarily a linoleic acid. So these linoleic acids, if you really research them, they just create massive inflammation in your body. Massive inflammation. And their whole purpose of an omega-6 fatty acid is actually to have you gain weight. A lot of the omega-6 foods come from seeds and nuts. And if any type of mammal that's looking to hibernate for the winter starts eating seeds and nuts, solely because the linoleic acid helps them gain fat. Yes, bears will eat those to help them gain fat because they need it for the winter. So for us, if we're constantly having canola oil, vegetable oil, all these different seed oils, palm oil, sunflower oil, all these different oils, they're actually an omega-6 that is going to create more inflammation, actually make our body cause more fat. On top of it, these type of unsaturated oils, the way that they're made, chemically made, wreaks massive inflammation in our body. You should avoid these at all costs. And that is why they're in all of your packaged foods, and they're used for cooking with all the time because they're super cheap. You can make more money. So what should you do? Avoid those seed oils, but what should you do? Look towards more of a ketogenic diet. Now, ketogenic diet just means that it's a lower carbohydrate diet. And this diet produces more ketones from ketosis. And these are made by the liver, and they're really broken down from fat. So your fat breaks down into ketones, and your body uses ketones for energy source. And they use this just like glucose in the Krebs cycle, that eventually that kicks out two different electron carrying capacities that go to the electron transport chain. So NADH and FADH. So that's the whole purpose of those ketones. That energy source initially is to kickstart that electron transport process in our mitochondria. And some people felt that ketones can't be used by the brain, so it's bad for the brain. That's not true. That the body and the brain actually use ketones as backup fuel, so it can be used for that. Now, insulin is a powerful inhibitor of ketogenesis. So if insulin is high, ketogenesis does not, it just stops. If insulin is low, ketogenesis occurs. So when you have low insulin over a period of time, that's where your body says we need to start using the fat off your body and start making energy out of it. That's your storage unit. But it can't do it if insulin is present. So we need to keep insulin low, consistently low. So ketogenic diets have really replaced carbs with dietary fat. That's what you're doing, because dietary fat has no effect on insulin. The switch results in a diet that keeps your insulin levels low and your ketones higher than normal. But it's important that the fats that you replace it with are more of a saturated fat or a coconut oil or an olive oil. By utilizing those, now you're going to be satiated, but also it's not going to create the inflammation in your body. It's not going to create more fat on your body. So let's look at ketosis and ketoacidosis, because sometimes people hear, hey, you don't want to get ketoacidosis from eating a low-carb diet. If you are an individual that doesn't have diabetes, your chance of actually getting ketoacidosis is near zero. So the state in which those ketones are increased above normal levels without any effect on blood pH is referred to ketosis. But ketones can affect the pH if they get too high, and this is when they reach 10 times higher than what's found in ketosis. The second tenfold is the cutoff between ketosis and ketoacidosis. So a person with type 1 diabetes will have a concern with this. A person with a functioning pancreas will have sufficient insulin production to prevent ketoacidosis, even with fasting. So if you have type 1 diabetes, you can't produce insulin. Your risk of ketoacidosis is present. A regular person that can produce insulin does not have the risk of ketoacidosis. Your body will produce insulin and will prevent that from happening. So your pH in your blood won't change. Other benefits of a carb restriction diet is what it does for your blood cholesterol. Remember that the LDL pattern is less problematic than LDL-B. So LDL-A versus B. This has to do with size. So eating more fat prompts LDL cholesterol to be more patterned as a benefit. Studies looked at different carbohydrates and the restricted diets overall, and they found an increase in LDL size. This is important because even those who are considered pattern B became demonstratively more pattern A, which is where it becomes bigger, more of a beach ball, floats on top of your blood, doesn't go to your blood vessels. They started to develop a higher size with a low-carb diet. So if eating fat and cholesterol, staples of a low carbohydrate diet, doesn't make LDL more dense, what does? Well, keeping a diet low in insulin changes your blood lipids. Insulin drives an alteration in LDL particle towards smaller and dense pattern Bs. So the more insulin resistant an individual becomes on average, well, what happens is that LDL size becomes smaller and more dense compared to the insulin sensitive person, which means you have a higher risk for cholesterol-related atherosclerosis. So overall, a high-fat diet presents a near paradox. Eating more fat actually changes your blood lipids to the better. But what about blood pressure? Some traditionalists contend that a high-fat diet promotes higher blood pressure, but the evidence indicates the opposite. High-fat diets had the largest drop in triglycerides, the greatest increase in LDL cholesterol, and also the largest drop in blood pressure of all of the tested diet groups. This was 4 times greater than the low-fat diet group. So across the board, going low carb, higher fat, with the right type of fat, more protein is better for you long term. It's going to help your reproductive health, like PCOS. PCOS and insulin resistance go hand in hand. Same thing with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, all have been found to benefit from a low-carb diet that controls insulin levels. Heartburn, high-fat diet is the most immediate reversal of heartburn. People that have GERD, go on a high-fat diet. It will take care of it. What about skin? Individuals with skin disorders, acne, inflammatory skin disorders, psoriasis, by controlling insulin in a high-fat diet takes care of those. And it also helps with aging. So aging, because it keeps our bodies young, our maintaining muscle, and lowers fat. So overall, what I'm trying to get to is when we're looking at insulin resistance, we need to consider the food that's going into our body. A calorie is not a calorie. We have to be very specific and say, hey, we need to minimize our carbohydrates. It benefits our skin, it benefits our health, it benefits our blood pressure, it benefits our fat around our midsection, it benefits our brain, it benefits our reproductive health, across the board. And we only do that not because we have to eat a low-carb diet, it's more that we have to control our insulin levels. We can do that through intermittent fasting, which we've talked about, so that we don't get spikes of insulin or we don't have maintaining high insulin all throughout the day. But the types of food that we eat, from protein, minimal insulin response, fat, no insulin response. So those low-carb diets help curb the insulin spikes, which only make our health better, makes our lives better, makes greater longevity for us, and across the board will give you the greatest chance of maintaining healthy weight, energy, blood pressure, liver enzymes, reduce your chance of fatty liver disease, and truly allow your energy systems to work for you instead of against you. So your inflammatory markers will go down. So across the board, I hope that you receive value from this video, that you're able to take something from here and realize that a low-carb, higher-fat diet is necessary for improving insulin resistance. And I hope you take this forward and start making the changes that you need to today. If at any point I can help you with that, just comment below and ask me your questions. I would love to answer those for you. And if you received any level of value out of this, please subscribe to this YouTube and possibly send to a friend that would benefit as well. All right, thank you for your time today.